just a general one for the panel. To get us going, 3 years this conference, again, just as I was saying earlier, given the amount of coverage that we've had about hacks from hacks like me, has that helped your job in terms of understanding at the board level?
That?
Yeah.
Absolutely it has. I think one of the most fascinating things that's happened over the last 3 to 5 years is awareness of the impact of cybersecurity has grown enormously. 5 years ago, I would have gone into a board and they would have said, cyber, deal with the IT guys, not interested. Now it's top of everyone's risk list. It's on the agenda. Understanding still has some way to go. And certainly, sort of trains coming down the track like GDPR, that's starting to excite a lot of thought. Why is it that it's top of everyone's risk list, but it's not top of everyone's investment list? And there's an interesting discrepancy that I'll put some thoughts out there in a minute, but I think that's a key.
Yeah, let's touch on that later. Jonathan?
Yeah, I'd echo that, certainly the awareness. So we deal with quite a lot of boards and looking at the kind of different questions that the board are asking, what's been addressed in the papers they get. So the awareness of the topic and the topic being on the agenda, much, much higher in the last 3 years. But the understanding of the topic and the relevance of the questions being asked still has a long way to go. So I think that's the challenge for today, is making sure that the people around the table who aren't necessarily there because of their cyber risk understanding can take a broad enough approach before they go narrow. And obviously the flip side of having such a lot of news coverage is that that's obviously what's going to take pride of place when people come in and go, oh, are we covered for that, or are we covered for this? And that's not necessarily the best way to get holistic coverage.
Yeah.
And Tom, I also think there's still a big gap between, a big challenge in the gap in the language that's used between boardroom and the people communicating the threats and the risks to them as well. And I think there's still some way to go in terms of developing a common language where the security people, guys, know that the reason they're there is to support the business strategy, and for the guys on the board to actually ask relatively informed questions, relatively simple questions, key questions, but to actually understand what they're hearing back. My other concern and comment about this, awareness has definitely grown, but I do think at events like this, we do tend to talk about the bigger organisation. We have the assumption that this goes across the whole of industry. SMEs, I think, still have got a long way to go, quite rightly in some respects, because I don't think we as an industry have done a very good job at communicating with the SMEs, and they have very specific requirements because they've got more pressing priorities in a whole host of other areas.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think in Nick's session earlier, we talked about Mr. Buffett and him saying that it takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to destroy it. And I think that's the other awareness that this thing's brought, is that under cyber security now, the business can lose its reputation very, very quickly. And I think that's another reason why it's brought it into the boardroom.
So I'd say there's good and bad to it, right? The great thing is we raised awareness. It's a discussion that's at the board level now. The bad part is that if you don't put it in the right context, it can actually distract from real problems. And so the key when reporting to the board on topics in the news is to provide context around how it might impact your organization and how you're prepared to deal with those types of events.
So in terms of that, and to pick up your point, Andrew, there about how to convince people to spend more money on it, and your point actually about, if you take a company like TalkTalk, which had a very damaging public hack, maybe not as bad as initially feared, but in terms of the reputation, but their share price is pretty much back where it was after that attack. So maybe it has an effect there. What's the best way to motivate a board to shift it? Is it saying your share price is going to tank, or is it saying your reputation? Do people really care about reputation as much as businesses think they do, or they, well, I'm just going to go with that because that's my broadband provider?
Yeah, we're part of Berkshire Hathaway, so our reputation is certainly at the top of our list. And I think that in terms of investment, for us, while you can do a lot with infrastructure, it's not the only thing, and I think we've focused pretty much on people and seeing our people as the first and strongest line of defence in that area. So without a lot of investment and on a very tight budget, I think you can do some pretty wonderful things with people, and not necessarily having to invest in hardware or software.
So we published some research earlier this year, which we set out to see whether there was a real correlation between share price impact and a cyber attack, a data breach. And we were conscious that in previous years that actually there'd been very little correlation, to your point, that companies recover and so on, but they do. TalkTalk at one time was, at least 15% below their peers as a result of that attack. But we found we sampled about 300 companies. We had we did Oxford Economics. We had Oxford Economics do it, so it was not just security guys telling you that you had a problem. It was a proper econometric study. 1.8% was the average impact of a cyber attack on a share price. So that's about £120 million off valuation for a FTSE 100. It was about $66 billion off the companies that we sampled. But the really interesting thing for me there was that actually if you went back 3 years, there was practically no impact. About 2 years, there was about 1.5%. 1 year ago, it was 2.7%. So there's a trend emerging there. And then you've got GDPR increasing the transparency there. So if that goes on and you start finding that you get a share price impact of 5, 6, 7%, that's real, that's board nightmares, that is. That's, really poor performance for a company to get impacted. But it shows the markets are becoming sensitive to this because they're the ones that are setting the price. So I think that will get attention. And I think that's a really good way of driving attention and investment. So I think that will change.
I think more and more, I see more and more organisations, although it's not a massive sample, actually seeing a bit similar to the way in which GDPR was presented earlier this morning as well, as good cyber resilience is a great opportunity to differentiate itself in your market as well, and to be seen as more trusted than your competitors down the road in making sure that your information is going to be more effectively protected. But also making yourself and using, completely concur with Karen's comment, using your people. If you're talking about on a budget, using your people in an effective way, providing effective learning to them, and using them to make sure that you are more difficult to compromise than anybody else. And the attackers, they won't take a lot before they move somewhere else.
So you want to demonstrate return on investment for your board, right? So the only way you can really do this is to have a really great risk management program. And to do that, you'll have to identify what your risks are, and then you'll have to assign a value to those risks. And that's a very difficult thing to do if anyone's ever tried to do that before. And so there's a couple of methodologies out there, like FAIR, for example, that allow you to assign a value, a dollar value to a particular risk that you have in your organization. And that's a great way to translate something that's technical into something that makes sense to leadership and the board to justify the type of investments that you want to make, whether it's a big one or a small one. So I've seen that be the most successful way. And then you also have to monitor that investment over time in terms of the likelihood of that risk happening, right? That risk decreasing over time, what monetary savings that will translate into over time. So that's a little bit of dodgy math. The first part, though, in sort of calculating what the risk is to a company is something that's totally achievable, and most organizations don't actually practice correctly.
On that point about risk, who assumes that risk? So when something like TalkTalk happens, it's Didier Harding who was in front of the cameras doing it. In the panel's experience, starting with you, do you find that chief executives realise this does lie with them, or are they trying to sort of shift it onto CIOs, people like that?
They realize that that risk applies to them when it happens, right? So they don't realize that beforehand. I think too often it's just the CISO or CIO that is the one that assumes the risk to start without much support from leadership. But things like Target and other breaches where you saw a mass exodus of the executive team, which in and of itself is a very expensive thing to happen to a company, that's raised, I think, a lot of awareness that executive leadership, even the board, can be held accountable.
Again, I think tone from the top is really important here. And I think that in our business, the tone was certainly set from the top, and our board and our executive colleagues are actually held accountable for it as a team, not as an individual. So I think it's the approach that each organisation can take, and it can do it very easily and I think quite quickly to make people to be held accountable for it, so that they do have their own personal objectives, and that the reward and compensation is also attached to it. So I think that's easy to do. I think that an organisation that says it's CIO, then I think the leader can very quickly change that.
Just going back to your initial question for a second, which was what's going to make the impact for the board members. So we're an SME that deals with large companies. So we see sort of both sides of the coin. What I found in both cases, in our company, every company we deal with, the thing that makes the biggest impact is something tangible, and that might not last for very long, but if there's something really tangible for a short time, you've got to make hay with that, with the senior people while it lasts. So GDPR, one of the best things about it, from my point of view, is possibly the worst thing from other people's point of view, which is the 4% revenue fine. Up to 4% of your revenue is a huge figure, and that really sticks in the mind. So we've been able to, you can talk about that at the moment and really get, what does that mean for us? Well, that means this many million or billion pounds. That's a lot. I'm going to use your research as well for the next two or 3 weeks. That's fantastic. So it's each time we have the conversation, it's a slightly different thing, but it's whatever's really real right then, and you've got to use it while you can, I think.
I was just going to say that there's a bit missing out of our discussion. Actually, triggered something that Nick said. It's about if you can make security, data protection a differentiating factor. The bit that's missing out of that is consumers and customers largely don't differentiate, don't discriminate on, if you look at all the big breaches, how many of them have really lost massive customer base? And TalkTalk's a fascinating case. It's going to be a Harvard Business School study for years to come on how they actually captured market share in the way that they responded over the subsequent months. So there's a different story that we need to start, getting consumers, all of us in this room, making positive decisions. If a company has poor security, demonstrably, you need to have zero tolerance for it. Move your bank, move your utility, whatever it is, because that market force will drive a real sea change in behaviour then.
I mean, I suppose the other approach on leadership and taking risks, I don't know if you saw the Equifax, but a couple of executives dumping all their stock just before they reported the breach. Might have been entirely unconnected, allegedly. Again, got to keep using that word. Nice and warmed up the panel. I think they're raring to go. Do any of you have any questions at this stage? Just raise your hand. If you do, we'll get a mic over to you. Yep, one over here. If you could say your name and where you're from, business-wise rather than geographically.
I'm just really thinking about the title of this. I mean, what is the budget? What should it be? Is it percentage of operating costs or something? And roughly what would that be? Thank you.
I don't think you can justify based on a percentage because each organization, each industry is different, has different risk profile to it. So it really has to do with, when I go and create a budget for an organization, say a defense contractor versus someone who's selling mattresses, right? There's definitely different risks there and different spend. And the way you assemble that budget is to first figure out what it is you're responsible for doing. And so you follow a framework like the NIST Cybersecurity Framework or ISO, which is really a list of different controls that you need to follow as an organization that practices security. And you make a risk-based decision in terms of what's applicable to you. And that gives you a map for what you need to plan for in your security program at a very high level. This is very high level. And then what you need to do is assign an understanding prioritization to those, where you're looking at each of those controls and understanding which one of them could most greatly impact you, like I said before, in terms of the total dollar value that it could impact you, and you start to address those components. And so much of your budget's going to be based on the risk that you assess to your organization and can justify to your leadership. And so that should be different by industries. Usually that's how it figures out, where banks are probably spending the most, right? And I don't know, someone that's in maybe mining may be spending the least, right, in terms of cybersecurity, just based on the business. I do not. I don't know if the rest of the panel does.
So there used to be a sort of folklore or rule of thumb that was about 5% of your IT budget. There's huge variability around that, and some market sectors are less, some are more. That seems to be rising to 6, 7, 8%, something like that. But that is, to the earlier point, that should not be a rule of thumb that says we're spending 5%, we're okay. That's just not how to think about it. The direct answer to your question of the budget, the real problem with budgets at the moment is they're just not large enough. People aren't spending enough, and they're not doing so proactively. The budgets suddenly become available when you have a public breach, and that's the wrong way around. People need to be saying, this can do us real harm, do my customers real harm, our shareholders real harm. What am I prepared to do? Given our risk profile, given the type of company we are, we should be spending this much, and if we're not, then we're failing.
I think that's one of the biggest challenges we as an industry face, is moving beyond this. Okay, we'll do something as and when it happens. to one where it's all about preparing for resilience rather than reacting to a real crisis, because a crisis will happen at some point. And making sure that, talking about working on a budget, if you don't have a tried, well-rehearsed and tested response plan for when that incident happens, you're going to be spending much more money as well in recovering.
That notion of rehearsing is really interesting. We talk about that. Cam, what you said about humans, sorry, I don't want too much stuff about AI, about people being the strongest defense is kind of obviously is a neat inversion of what we hear about the insider threat, people being the weakest defense. How do you convince people who, well, not convince them, how do you teach people who maybe don't know this stuff, you don't learn it at school necessarily. How do you take them through and make them aware of the importance and make them good at it?
Yeah, we certainly have started from a principle that says actually this is something that we've got to add to people's toolbox. It's going to be part of your job, just like using Word and Excel. It's a skill. We've got to help you learn. And on that basis, we've done a couple of things. So in 2016, we had, unbeknown to our executive, a third party tailgate one of our employees through the office door. So they were in, and they kindly left some USB sticks on different floors of the building. They had backpacks on. When we looked at the security CCTV, we didn't know what was in the backpack. They left the building, and only as staff started to bring the USB sticks did we realise we had an issue. And all our staff handed the USB sticks in. Nobody compromised us, so that was a great result for our staff. We took a serious decision to evacuate the building. There was a backpack. We didn't know where it was. They left without it. So across our business, we took about 200 people out of the building. And that created a really strong story and a really strong, memorable kind of like practice of our resilience to that kind of intruder. And the intruders had left our site and went back to a hotel, and then were trying to then, through a video conferencing suite, not recognising that they weren't protected to the same level as laptops and other computers in the building, were able to access our network. And the impact of that is we actually then practice going without systems on that site for nearly the rest of the day. So as a test of our resilience and what we needed to do and how we would approach it, as a national infrastructure, we practice these things regularly. So we went into our major incident plan. We ran it as if it was real. We didn't know anything else until we had come out the other side of it. People really remember that, so it resonated with them. They understood the risk. They kind of felt it, so they could touch it, feel it. And that then made security per se, not just phishing and cyber security, but their personal security really important to them. And I think we've then widened that topic to be safe and secure through that process. And then what we've done on the back of that is then just start to run out an educational and training program for people so that they can learn about this and they can take it home to their friends and family and talk about it at home as well, because we've really tried to make the connection between home and work, that this just isn't about a work activity. And I think that resonates with a lot of people, and putting things into language that is clear, simple to understand. And we have a helpline, we have a 3-digit number that people can phone anytime and get guidance and advice if they're unsure. So that's kind of how we've went around it. We also then, as an executive team this year, experienced going to our annual conference with all of our executive across Berkshire Energy. And during that, they ran a live attack in the room. And you watched on the screen by platform, by our different business groups, the hackers and the percentages of how many people they were grasping across every group. and they were able to go straight across all the businesses. And I think, again, that brought it real for senior people and executives as well. So I think making it real for people, and a bit like Nick said earlier about telling the story, is really important, because I think that makes the connection for people.
Andrew.
I was gonna, yeah, there's real lessons in that. I think making it real for people. To your point about getting into buildings, as one of my guys said, I can get into any building with 2 cups of coffee. And you think about that. So he's a red team tester. You know, he's just tailgating someone. You know, don't make me get my pass out. You know, it's that kind of thing. Really effective. Very shocking what you can get into in buildings. But a somewhat esoteric, but and perhaps dull thing is there's a thing called ICMH, Information Classification, Marking and Handling. I worked on a standard from BSI, BS 10010 earlier this year. That's about getting people to think about how to classify a bit of information you're creating, so a document, an email, something like that, marking it, and then handling it according to that marking. So dull stuff, potentially, and in government, you're very used to it. It's been going on for decades. But actually, what it does, the organisations I've seen implement it, it makes everyone sit down. Every time you write an email, you've got to think, okay, what am I writing? Is this sensitive? Is this confidential? You know, you can't send the email without saying, you know, it's this kind of sensitivity. And that really gets people into thinking about everything they do, whether it's copying something on a photocopier or it's sending an email, writing a Word document, creating a spreadsheet. Because they're forced to do that, they have to think about it. And it changes people's attitudes to, actually, day by day, I'm generating all sorts of confidential information. I need to be a lot more careful. I need to start paying attention to what I need to do. So something simple. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's a tiny bit of friction. It's literally 5 seconds at the front end of, you know, something you're creating. But we're all creators of confidential, sensitive information, but we don't think about it. So to the earlier point about bringing it home to everyone, that's a really great way of making everyone feel that they are responsible for sensitive information and how to handle it.
I say that last sentence as well is one of the big challenges we found, is making everybody feel they're responsible. So great example about how to make people realise there's always a watershed moment. You can kind of see it individual by individual when they realise this is something that I should be caring about. But in the meantime, how do you try and avoid a situation where it's kind of management or the InfoSec team saying you should do this, and then we're going, yeah, sure, because they'll always then try and find ways around it until they have that watershed moment. So on Trick, we've found, not a Trick so much, but the Information Security Committee is an official thing. It meets, it's got some experts in it who go area by area, but actually a key part of it is that we have people on there from each of the business units who aren't experts. They never were. To start with, they were slightly worried about it. We invited them in, sort of de-jargonized things for them, and we targeted individuals across different teams. Not everybody all at once, but the aim was to create champions. So basically people who go back to their business unit and say, you know, this isn't actually complicated, and no, it's not a tech problem. It's something we can do, and yeah, those keys shouldn't be left on the desk just there. What if someone was to walk in? Because you can't do that from on high. You need people around the organization doing it, and that's had the... who was it said earlier? It's more of a marketing. It's like an internal marketing campaign. There's the technical aspect, but there's really the people bit, and how do you get this message across and change mindsets? So you almost get your marketing team to do a campaign for you internally and say, well, how do we do this? How do we make this go viral internally? But that was a big thing for us, the champions in the business units.
I think that's, whenever I go into it's probably too much information. In all the Lose at Sky, they've got loads of data protection things, and that's probably not going to change behaviour. So that's actually good to get some real examples of how to do it. Any more questions at this stage? Again, just stick your hand up if you'd like to ask the expert anything. No? Okay, have a bit more of a think, because I would like to have some questions, guys. You can do better than this. Hey, there we go. A bit of bullying, and you get a question. Fantastic.
So whilst the long-term impact of share price on the company stock price is kind of, you know, of a breach on some of the stock prices maybe not proven, it's undoubtable that the short-term impact is pretty significant. I think Equifax is, what, 20% down now, or thereabouts? Do we, and I see that getting worse with the fines going up, does a panel think that this is going to be something that's actually going to be exploited more and more by attackers? I'm thinking MedSec and Muddy Waters very recently, for instance.
Personally, yes, absolutely. I think I was at a conference recently where there was a panel discussion between 4 CISOs, and they were saying when GDPR comes in, and over time, it's not going to happen on May the 26th next year, But there will be more and more people out there that are deliberately trying to trip organisations up and then say, we have your information, and unless you pay us this money, we're going to report you to the ICO. It's those sorts of scenarios that are likely to happen. So ransomware, I think, will increase. So yeah, I think that's a common thing. One thing I would say is that I welcome GDPR because, as again was said, I think it was Carolyn earlier on at the ICO was saying data privacy and cybersecurity are inextricably linked, and they absolutely are. And I think that I welcome the fact that security, and it comes back to something that Andrew was saying, that security needs to move into a privacy discussion, and it's just a fantastic opportunity for any organisation to take an advantage in their markets of being more effective in both cyber resilience and in data privacy. And data privacy has been around for years and years and years. 15 years ago, I was going into meetings talking about good data governance, data classification. But now, of course, the world has changed since then, and it's that much more difficult.
Was the question also about people using the fact of the move in share price as a result of a breach in order to make money? Because that's something that I think is quite fascinating. I mean, there are examples, they're not widely publicised at the moment, but quite a lot of examples of if you knew ahead of time what to look for, you could tell on the stock exchanges which businesses were about to have leaks happen to them, because a few people already are taking advantage of that. There's actually a lot more money potentially to be made by selling short on Equifax before you release the data than there is by selling the data later, because a 20% impact the next day. And if you can do it without being traced. So I think that's something we'll see a lot more. I don't have any answers for how to deal with it, but it's something we'll see a lot more of. There'll be a lot more interest in how to spot what's about to happen via what certain people are doing or certain trends on unexplained trends in the markets, for sure, yeah.
There's already evidence of something similar to that happening where attackers are exploiting the fact they can access executive emails to trade on that data. There was a big incident of that maybe a few years ago called Fin1, where financial attackers, or it was a Fin2, but financial attackers were going into biotech companies, looking at their emails, and then trading on advanced information for mergers and acquisitions. And that stuff has been going on for a very long time. So it seems pretty easy to say that they may go into a mode where they're trading on potential victims that they have control over. In terms of holding them ransom, I don't think maybe that's a big driver, just because you'd be breaking the law. And larger organizations would tend not to break the law, my hope would be, in order to conceal an incident and not pay the fines.
Any other questions? Yeah, one here. You get the microphone. And another there. But we'll do that afterwards.
Andrew Smith. I'm from the Smart Metering organisation in the UK. Can we turn this round into what positive things could come out of here? What opportunities are there that the board, when they come up with a great idea, hey, we're going to go into Russia and expand into there, or we've just had an email saying we're being held to ransom, and actually you can turn around and say, well, yeah, let's have a quick look across. No, this is a hoax. Or, yes, we've got good enough cyber defences to allow that expansion. So have you got any stories and examples of those positive things, that opportunities that the board, when they come up with an idea, you can actually say, yes, you can go for it because we've got probably a high maturity of cyber security?
Yeah, go for it.
So that's a great point, and I think we're just reaching a tipping point where the first few companies, I think, are starting, certainly in my experience, are starting to say your point there that good security can be an enabler. I think historically, and the vast majority of companies still see security as a blocker, as a grudge purchase, as something that they have to invest in because there's compliance obligations or something like that. But exactly to your point, some are saying, actually, all the great things we want to do in the future, we want to use more cloud services, we want to use more mobile, contact with our sales channels, et cetera, all the good, the exciting things that's going to bring top line growth, bottom line growth. Now that just a few of them have just started saying, you know what, we've got to bake security in right at the beginning, because that's the only way to crack that, and it will give us confidence in that these out there technologies are going to give us the return that we want. But I think it's only just starting to happen, and it's quite a hard argument in the vast majority of places.
We provide software to boards, so obviously security is a pretty big consideration, and our software is cloud-based. So we have been the test case for quite a few boards of major organisations for the first time that company has gone through how to properly do due diligence on a cloud software provider. And we've had a surprising amount of excitement from the IT team doing the due diligence, because they see this as they've been trying for ages to use some services that they're going to think this is going to be great, this is going to be really convenient, and then it's just been blocked because at some level someone is nervous and doesn't have the understanding. So finally there's pressure from the board to use this software, and we go through what is, to be fair, a very onerous process first time round, but to really understand what the questions are. And then that IT team is then enabled to use the same framework for purchasing other services. So that's, I think, that maybe doesn't help the top line, but that really helps the company's efficiency, because you can now be more comfortable with, we understand the difference between this kind of provider and that kind of provider. We know how to tell if this is as safe as we need it to be versus stay well away. It can really enable the purchasing of services.
There's a question over there. You can get a microphone. Thanks.
George Ong, Northern Ireland Water. In relation to board responsibility and what we've heard today, when you have cybersecurity, which is IT and industrial control system, when you look at GDPR, you look at the National NIS Directive coming to place in May 2018 as well, look at the critical infrastructure requirements, the CNI controls, and we heard about Brexit impact as well. As a board, how are you going to pull all this together, and what's your black swan, the worst case scenario, and what is the greatest opportunity, and how do you protect the reputation of the company?
How do you think about that? For any hackers listening, what's the best way to take down Northern Powergrid?
I think, well, many of you might have seen the programme on Channel 4 in terms of a black start. We're working collaboratively across our platforms on what we classify as grid resilience, so that we have a plan in place to protect our national infrastructure. So I think that the opportunity for us is to make that investment. I think our organisation certainly recognises that. It's got to do that for our infrastructure and to protect you as customers. So I think that's been the opportunity for us. I think the other part that I would say is that today we've talked about a number of different items across the piece, from cyber to the data piece. And it's what I said earlier, that as a board, we have put together safe and secure in its widest sense, from your personal safety all the way to cyber, to making sure that your data is secure. So I think that this is, for many businesses, a journey. Some people will be at different stages, and some people may not even have started it. But we've certainly decided that security piece has to come as a whole and not as individual pieces. And I think that's how we've dealt with it.
Yeah, Nick was saying earlier, the phrase that sometimes it's a case of being hard enough to tackle that attackers will go elsewhere. So perhaps this isn't the case in your case, because you actually, national infrastructure, very important. For a business that's selling mattresses or is just a normal business, there are levels and levels of you have to reach in order to be secure. There's sort of national security up here, and right down here there's leaving the front door open so anyone can just walk in. And I think for the state we see at the moment, a lot of businesses are quite a lot closer to this than they are to that. So there's a lot of very basic stuff that needs to be done, very, very low-hanging fruit. I mean, if you look at the recent ransomware, if the companies that got hit had up-to-date versions of the Windows operating system, they couldn't have been hit. So that's such a basic thing. So when we're looking at what is the black swan, there are so many potential black swans. Unless you sort of take a real look at the basics first and sort of work your way up this hierarchy, you could be the most sophisticated in terms of your response to one very particular kind of hack and be leaving the front door open elsewhere. So sort of taking a step back and looking at the whole thing and working your way up.
Well, I was just going to pick up something in both of those. I think a great word is resilience, actually. I don't think it's just about having good security. It's about how you respond when something does go wrong. Most of the organisations that have responded well, get through it pretty easily. So it's not just about that fortress mentality that somehow you've got all the technology, the processes in place to stop something happening. It's about how you respond, the people, the organisation, the authorities and so on, how quickly you do that. And that resilience word is a real focus I think people need to put more thought into.
I think that point about black swans, like all these big, lots of these big hacks, unless it's a nation state coming after you, and they're white swans. Talk was an ancient attack. WannaCry, again, like you say, if they'd updated, the problem with, say, the NHS and is it's very hard to update their systems and keep a hospital functioning and buying in. So again, it comes back to the idea of staff. Just in terms of actually running it, running the show, David, when it comes, if you're buying cybersecurity software, what should people be doing? Should they be looking at their problems going, a bit of that, bit of that, bit of that? Or should they be going like, that's a bit of a faff, let's just go for a comprehensive solution?
Sure. So, as a CISO, one of my jobs is to go and purchase technology, right? So everyone knows people, process, and technology. And one of the challenges I see most organizations, or one of the mistakes I see most organizations make, is they go out and buy a little bit of everything. And they forget to realize that you need infrastructure to support each one of those. You need people that are knowledgeable. You need processes around those. And you need to integrate all of those together. And that's very difficult to do. So back to before what I said about a framework, what it helps you organize is sort of the thought process for what's required in an information security program. And you can map products to each of those areas and try and find a good balance where you're not buying too many products, but you're satisfying the major requirements that you have as part of a good security program. So to me, it's about, and this, honestly, I think most people have an unlimited budget or a growing budget in cybersecurity. The challenge is people are just tired of spending so much, so they're looking for the consolidation. So I think this is one of the most important aspects when selling a budget, is showing that you're not just buying everything, you're taking a planned approach to what you want to purchase, and you're showing signs of consolidation where you're picking an individual set of solutions to focus on broad spectrum. So what I like to talk about normally is you may choose an endpoint platform. You may choose an aggregation platform that collects and aggregates your data for visualization. You may have a network platform. And then you may have some other solutions around those that really bring it together in a concise way. But you shouldn't be buying something to solve each solution, because I think we all know there's probably 800 or 900 different vendors calling you every day.
We're just running out of time here, but does anyone from the audience have another question? Yeah, one here. Gentleman in the nice tie. It's a great tie. Yeah.
They do shirts in the same too.
It might be a bit much, the double effect.
Okay. The problem that I'm seeing as an insurance broker, talking to SME clients, is that not only do they not know the questions to ask, they don't even know that there are questions to ask, and they don't even accept that there is a problem. How, bearing in mind that SMEs are supposed to be the engine that grows the UK economy, how would the panel get these points across?
Yeah, go for it.
We went through a sort of a round of cybersecurity insurance, because some of our clients required that we had it a couple of years ago. And there was a big wake-up call for very senior people in our organisation when we found the difference in premiums if we couldn't answer sufficiently certain questions that the insurance company was putting to us. Now, I don't know if this is a universal amongst the insurance companies, but this particular one had actually what turned out to be a very good framework for how to think about cyber risk. And it started off at a high level, and then there were lots and lots of sub-questions. And every time the high-level questions came back to the board and went back to the insurance company, the premium was huge until we could adequately answer them. So it's that kind of using the fact that it's much more expensive if you can't do it properly, really focus minds. So I don't know, at the moment, maybe for companies where cybersecurity isn't such a big deal, obviously big deal as it is for us, maybe they'll just look elsewhere if one company tries to enforce that. But that's what made a difference for us.
No, it's not even getting to that point. It's getting to the point where they accept that there is a risk, and that they then proceed to look at what questions they should ask about that risk. How do we get SMEs to even see that there is a risk in the first place?
Okay, well, for us, that came from our large clients saying, you've got to show that you're compliant to these standards, and the awareness grew. And then we went to the insurance company and they said, here are the questions you need to ask. So it came that way for us.
In a sense, it's got to hurt. A lovely line from an SME I know, the MD said, well, my IT department is me on a Sunday afternoon. And that really struck home. But unless it's actually, and the same problem applies to small companies as applies to us as citizens. We don't take it seriously because by and large it doesn't hurt us. If somebody steals our credit card details, it's covered by the credit card companies. Bank, same. We don't actually, apart from the occasional identity theft and things like that, it doesn't hurt us, so we don't pay attention to it. So it's only that pain. It's only to the point where you're not going to get the business or you're not going to get the insurance until you can show that you've done the right things. Okay, now I've got to take it seriously.
Further question of the questions you should be asking, and we'll wrap up on this. If you're chief executive for the day, what are the 3 questions you should be asking your security team to understand where your weaknesses are? Nick, why don't we start with you on that one? And if we could, so we're getting over, so it's rapid fire from all the panel members.
If I was a new CEO on board with a new team, that's never going to happen, by the way. I'd want to know what the cyber resilience strategy is and all the elements of that strategy, and making sure that that resilience strategy supported the business strategy, because otherwise there's no point in having a resilience strategy. It has to support what the business aims and wants to do. You need to ask a very simple question: what is most important for us to protect? You can't protect everything. That's a very simple question. For many organisations, it's quite a difficult one to answer. Not just what information, then who's got access to it, where is it, etc., etc. And finally, coming back to the people side, I would be, and in terms of budget, I'd want to make sure that everyone in our organisation understood the role, the critical role they have to play in being, as Karen said, the strongest defence against the attacks. There is a fourth thing, and is making sure also that the critical importance of knowing what you're going to do when in responding to an attack, because an attack will happen. It comes back to this preparing more effectively and doing some of the simple things very, very well, patching, people awareness, etc.
Really good point. Rather than repeating those points, which I'm sure we all agree with from there, is there anything else, guys, that you think you should ask on top of that?
Yeah.
David?
Yeah, sure. So I did incident response for 6 years, and so responded to roughly 100 different breaches. And during that time, there's probably 2 or 3 questions you could always ask to predict how vulnerable an organization was, or how likely they were to have a breach. And typically, one is how many unmanaged assets do you have? And you can only know that answer if you're tracking that. The second is how many systems are unpatched, or more precisely, how long does it take you to patch a system with a critical vulnerability? Most people will say 60, 90 days. That's not a really great number, if they even know that. And then the other one is, do you use a standard configuration baseline? And if you can answer those 3 questions, most of the time the organizations were doing a good job and less likely to be breached. Most of the people I responded to couldn't answer those 2 things. One last one, sorry, I got to do a number 4, because you did it, is multi-factor authentication. So if you don't have multi-factor authentication for externally sitting web services like email or VPN, you're definitely at a high risk. So it's amazing how accurate those 4 questions can be.
I kind of like to know who's shorting my stock. I love that idea, and I think you mentioned Die Hard earlier. I think that was the theme of Taking a Pelham, the remake of Taking a Pelham 1, 2, 3, except it was gold then. The point behind that is that actually the adversaries out there are endlessly inventive and devious in the ways that they will find ways of getting money, doing harm, and your organisation has to be equally agile. It has to be. It has to have the skills, and the skills are few and far between. And you ought to be asking yourself, why is my organisation doing it? If it's not your crown jewels, why are you running IT? Use cloud services, use an outsourced company. Think about that.
My points would echo Nick's quite, but I'd reverse the order. I'd start with who is responsible, and do they know what they're doing? That would be where I would start, at the top level and at each level. And then I would roughly follow what Nick said in terms of priorities. Yeah.
No, I agree. I think that knowing your team as well, what you've got on the ground, who you've got, and making sure that they have the appropriate skills to do what you need to do and to look ahead and know what's coming. It's really important, and that's another part that we've done is start to invest in cyber apprentices for our team, because the people are not there. You can't find them. And so you have to grow your own. That would be the other part.
Well, on that, thank you very much to the panel, Andrew, Nick, Karen, David, and Jonathan. Really appreciate You're in such. We have a round of applause for the panel. They're great.